Welcome back to the deep dive. You guys know the drill. You give us the research, and we kind of jump in and unearth the coolest stuff from it. So think of us like knowledge Sherpas or something like that.
I like it.
And today we're going global.
Mm-hmm.
A deep dive into Indigenous peoples' rights around the world. And we're going to be focusing on the IWGIA's the Indigenous World 2013 report.
Mm.
I was looking at this thing, I was like, this is massive.
Yeah,
I mean, this is a whole year
it is
captured in this report.
Yeah, it's a really comprehensive overview of everything that was happening during that year.
Of the challenges, the victories, the ongoing struggles.
Yeah, and they were facing some
For
pretty
Indigenous communities all over the planet.
intense challenges at the time.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So this report,
Everything from
well, it talks about everything.
the repercussions of the rubber boom
Oh, the rubber boom.
in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Okay.
To land rights battles in Russia and in places like that.
Okay.
It also explores,
Oh, yeah. Movements like Idle No More in Canada
Mm-hmm.
and land recovery efforts in Costa Rica.
Okay.
It's really pretty fascinating.
That's awesome. Before we kind of jump into specifics, though,
Yeah.
what was the big picture for you? What surprised you the most when you dug into all this?
Well, the first thing that struck me was just how incredibly diverse Indigenous peoples and their situations are globally.
Oh, yeah.
You've got everything from, small, isolated tribes in the Amazon to large and politically active Indigenous groups in North America.
Mm-hmm.
But despite these huge differences, there is this common thread, and that is the lasting effects of colonialism.
Yeah.
It's a shadow that still hangs over so many Indigenous communities and impacts everything from their land rights to their cultural survival.
Right. So colonialism, that's kind of the elephant in the room.
Absolutely.
Or I guess the conquistador in the rainforest
Yeah.
in this case.
Yeah.
And I see this UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Yeah. UNDRP mentioned a lot. Is that the key to kind of fixing these historical wrongs?
Yeah, so UNDRP is a really powerful framework for recognizing and protecting Indigenous rights. It was a landmark achievement when the UN General Assembly adopted it back in 2007. But of course,
Wow.
turning those rights into reality is a whole other story, and this report really shines a light on that
Yeah.
uneven progress in implementing UNDRP in different countries.
Mm.
Some countries, outright voted against it,
Yeah.
and then others are dragging their feet on ratifying even these basic conventions like ILO 169, which focuses specifically on Indigenous and tribal peoples.
Oh, wait, hold on. Countries voted against basic human rights for Indigenous people.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
What's the logic there?
Well, there's often this disconnect between recognizing rights on paper and actually respecting them in reality.
I see.
Some countries, see these declarations as a threat to their national sovereignty or their economic interests.
Right.
And sometimes it's just, a lack of political will to actually make the necessary changes. That's super disheartening.
Yeah.
But let's zoom in on some specific places. I'm really curious about this Idle No More movement you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
What made it so important in Canada?
So Idle No More was this amazing grassroots movement
Yeah.
that just exploded in Canada in 2012.
Okay.
It started with 4 women in Saskatchewan who were really concerned about this bill, Bill C-45.
Mm-hmm.
They saw it as a threat to Indigenous treaty rights and environmental protections.
Okay.
They started organizing,
Yeah.
and their message spread like wildfire through social media.
Wow.
It was really inspiring.
The power of grassroots
Yeah.
activism.
Absolutely.
So what were the outcomes of this? Did it actually change any government policies?
Well, it didn't result in any immediate policy reversals,
Okay.
but it did have a huge impact on the Canadian political landscape.
I see.
It brought Indigenous issues to the forefront of the national conversation,
Mm.
and it forced the government to really acknowledge the concerns of these communities. It also, inspired a whole new generation of Indigenous activists and leaders.
That's huge.
Yeah.
The report also mentioned a UN special rapporteur
Yeah.
on the right to food visiting Canada that same year.
Mm-hmm.
That seems odd. What was that about?
It was actually the first time that a UN special rapporteur on the right to food had ever visited a developed country,
Okay.
and his findings were pretty scathing.
Oh.
He criticized Canada for having an appallingly poor record
Wow.
on addressing Indigenous food insecurity.
Mm-hmm.
Despite the fact there had been so many recommendations from UN human rights bodies.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was pretty bad.
That's a pretty harsh assessment, especially for a country that prides itself
Yeah.
on its human rights record.
It was a wake-up call for Canada. It
Yeah.
really highlighted those deep inequalities
Yeah.
faced by indigenous communities, particularly when it comes to having access to nutritious and culturally appropriate food.
Right.
And he emphasized how food security is inextricably linked to land rights, something that resonates really deeply with indigenous peoples.
Yeah, for sure. So Canada clearly had some work to do. What about the U.S.?
Yeah, well, the report shows that indigenous peoples in the U.S. continue to face a lot of the same challenges: poverty, discrimination, and violence.
Okay.
One example that really stuck out to me was the situation on the Fort Berthold Reservation.
Hmm.
They were in the middle of this oil boom,
Okay.
skyrocketing rent infrastructure problems.
Wow.
But get this, 60% of the reservation's members
Yeah,
weren't seeing any of the profits.
that's crazy.
Yeah, it's just outrageous.
It's like the classic case of
Yeah,
resource extraction benefiting outsiders
absolutely.
and the local community being left behind
Exactly.
to deal with all the consequences.
Yeah, it's a pattern we see time and time again.
Yeah.
But there were some positive developments in the U.S., too.
Yeah.
The report mentions the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act that was passed in 2013, and it strengthened tribal courts' authority to actually prosecute non-native perpetrators of domestic violence on tribal lands.
That's great.
Yeah, it was a big step forward.
Especially considering how much
Yeah,
violence
exactly.
is directed
Except for,
at indigenous women.
yeah.
Sounds like a mixed bag in the U.S.
Yeah.
Progress on some things,
Yeah.
but still
Complicated picture.
a long way to go.
Yeah.
Now let's go further south to Mexico and Central America.
Okay.
The report talks about the Zapatista uprising in Chiapas back in 1994
Right.
and the ongoing struggle for indigenous autonomy and land rights there.
Yeah.
In 2012, there was this massive peaceful protest.
Yeah.
Tens of thousands of indigenous people.
Yeah. It was huge.
What a demonstration of
Yeah.
resilience
Yeah, really powerful.
and determination.
Yeah.
The report also mentions indigenous communities in Guatemala protesting against this El Tambor mine.
Yeah.
What was going on there?
So the El Tambor mine was contaminating water sources and just causing widespread environmental damage. Okay.
The indigenous communities who depended on those resources were furious.
Makes sense.
They organized protests,
Yeah.
but they were met with violent repression from the government.
Wow.
It's a scary reminder of the risks that these people take to defend their land and their environment.
That's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
So are there any places where things are moving in a positive direction?
Well, the report does highlight some positive examples. In Costa Rica,
Yeah.
for example, indigenous communities were actively involved in land recovery efforts, reclaiming lands that had been illegally taken from them.
Wow.
But even there, progress on this law for the autonomous development of indigenous peoples was stalled by bureaucracy and political roadblocks.
It's like so much talk about recognizing indigenous rights, but actually putting those words into action.
Yeah.
That's a whole different ballgame.
It's a constant struggle.
It really is.
Yeah.
So now let's shift gears to South America.
Okay.
The impact of these extractive industries on indigenous communities.
Right.
It's a major theme in this report. Absolutely.
The Plus Petrol oil spill in Peru.
Yeah.
The Belo Sun mine in Brazil.
Mm-hmm.
These are just a couple of examples of massive environmental damage
yeah.
and displacement.
Yeah, and leaving these indigenous communities to deal with the consequences.
It's heartbreaking to think about the impact on these communities
Yeah.
who are so connected
It is.
to their land and their natural resources.
It's this constant tension between economic development and human rights.
Exactly. The report also talks about the Yanomami people in Venezuela
Right.
facing threats from illegal gold mining and violence.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even in countries with governments that are considered to be progressive, indigenous rights are not always a priority.
It's a reminder that there's so much more to this issue than we might realize on the surface.
Absolutely.
So what about other parts of the world?
Hmm.
Are there any bright spots? Or is it all bad news?
Well, there are glimmers of hope,
Okay.
but the challenges are definitely persistent. Let's take Russia, for example. The report paints a pretty bleak picture there. They focus on this failure to establish territories of traditional nature use, or TTNUs, even though a law was passed back in 2001.
Over a decade.
Yeah, it's crazy. More than a decade later, and not a single federal TTNU has actually been established.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah, it's really frustrating.
What's the holdup? Why is something like recognizing traditional land use so difficult?
Well, it often comes down to a clash of interests.
Okay.
You have these powerful industries like Norilsk nickel,
Mm-hmm.
which is one of the biggest polluters in the whole country,
Wow.
operating in these regions, often with little regard for the environment or for the indigenous communities who live there.
I see.
The report describes these devastating effects of these extractive industries on the Nenets, the Inets, and the Dolgan people in Siberia.
Yeah.
Pollution, displacement, loss of livelihoods. It's a familiar story.
It's like David and Goliath, but with way higher
Yeah,
stakes.
it is.
And it doesn't sound like the government is really on the side of David in this case.
No, unfortunately not. The report also details how the government has been cracking down on indigenous organizations,
Wow.
like Arakan, the Russian Association of Indigenous Peoples of the North.
Mm-hmm.
It's a clear attempt to silence dissent and make it harder for these people to advocate for their rights.
Wow. That's scary.
Yeah.
So what about Asia? What were some of the key takeaways from that region?
So Asia is this vast and diverse region, and the report captures that complexity. In Japan, for instance, we see the Ainu people really pushing for recognition and cultural revitalization.
Okay.
They even formed a new political party in 2011,
Wow.
which shows this growing desire for self-representation.
That's progress, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
People finding ways to make their voices heard
Exactly.
within the political system.
Yeah.
Sadly, though, the report also talks about widespread land grabbing and this kind of development aggression
Mm-hmm.
against indigenous peoples in places like the Philippines, Indonesia,
Mm-hmm.
Malaysia. One really shocking example was the burning of 50 houses belonging to indigenous people in Sumbawa, Indonesia,
Yeah.
by the government in 2012.
It was awful.
They were forced
Mm.
out
Yeah.
to make way for a forest concession
Yeah, basically.
and a mining company.
Yeah.
That's horrible. It's hard to believe the kind of disregard for human rights
It is.
is still happening in the 21st century.
Yeah.
And I imagine the conflict in Kachin State in Burma
Right.
just makes things even more complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. The conflict has had a devastating impact on indigenous communities there,
Yeah.
displacing them from their lands, disrupting their livelihoods,
Mm-hmm.
and exposing them to violence and all kinds of human rights abuses.
It's easy to get caught up in these big headlines and forget about the individual human stories that are behind these conflicts.
Absolutely.
So we've talked about the Americas, Russia, Asia. What about Africa?
Mhm.
What does the report say about the situation there?
Well, the report highlights the marginalization of pastoralist communities in Kenya
Okay.
who are fighting for land rights and recognition.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they face discrimination, they face displacement, their traditional livelihoods are threatened
Right.
by development projects and land grabs. It's a reminder that indigenous peoples aren't just found in rainforests or remote villages.
Yeah.
You know, they're part of diverse ecosystems and ways of life all over the world.
It's important to remember that diversity.
Yeah.
The report also mentions forced evictions of indigenous communities from conservation areas in Tanzania.
Mm-hmm.
That seems kind of counterintuitive.
Yeah.
Aren't indigenous people the best stewards of the environment?
It's complicated.
Yeah.
The desire to protect biodiversity is really important,
Right.
and it shouldn't come at the expense of indigenous people's rights and livelihoods.
Right.
The report emphasizes the need to strike a balance,
Yeah.
ensuring that conservation efforts involve real consultation with indigenous communities and respect for their traditional knowledge and perspectives.
Okay, so it's about working together
Exactly.
and not imposing solutions from the outside.
Yeah.
I'm sensing a theme here. Respect,
Yeah.
consultation,
Yeah.
recognizing the rights of indigenous peoples to make their own decisions about their futures.
Absolutely.
What about the Middle East?
Okay.
What challenges are highlighted there?
Well, the report shines a light on the situation of the Jahalin Bedouin
Okay.
in the Jerusalem periphery. They're facing displacement because of Israeli settlement expansion,
Mm-hmm.
particularly the development of this area called E1,
Okay.
which would essentially cut off East Jerusalem from the West Bank
Wow.
and further isolate Palestinian communities.
That's a really sensitive
yeah, it's a very
and politically charged situation.
it's a highly sensitive situation.
It really underscores how interconnected land rights are with these broader geopolitical issues.
Yeah, absolutely. The Jahalin Bedouins' struggle for their land is completely tied up with the larger Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Right.
It highlights how hard it is to uphold indigenous rights in conflict zones,
Yeah.
where power is often unbalanced and justice can be hard to find.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
The Americas, Russia, Asia, Africa.
Mm-hmm.
It's clear that Indigenous peoples are facing this wide range of challenges.
Yeah, they are.
But
Oh,
I'm also struck by their resilience,
yeah, me too.
their determination
Yeah,
to fight for their rights
absolutely.
and protect their cultures.
Yeah, that's something that really comes across in this report.
It's inspiring, and it makes me wonder what our role is in all of this
Yeah.
and supporting their struggles.
Yeah.
But before we get into that, let's take an even deeper dive into some of these big themes and challenges
Okay.
that emerge from this report.
Sounds good.
Stay tuned for part 2.
So as we were going through all those regional spotlights,
Yeah.
it became clear that Indigenous peoples around the world, they face these unique challenges in each region,
Mm-hmm.
but there are some common threads running through their experiences.
Yeah, it's like a tapestry, right?
Yeah.
Different patterns, different colors, but there's a shared story
Yeah, exactly.
woven through it all.
That's a great way to put it.
What are some of those big themes that jumped out at you?
Well, one of the biggest and most prominent, and it's probably not surprising, is the ongoing battle for land rights.
Makes
The report makes it very clear
Yeah,
that for Indigenous peoples, land is not just a resource.
right. It's much more than that.
Yeah, it's profoundly connected to their cultures, their livelihoods, their very identities.
Yeah, it's more than just owning a piece of property.
Exactly.
It's about their spiritual beliefs, their traditions, their
Yeah.
sense of belonging.
Absolutely.
So I can see why that would be worth fighting for.
Absolutely. And that's why you see these struggles for land tenure security all over the world. We see it in so many different ways.
Yeah.
Land grabbing development projects, encroaching on indigenous territories, legal battles to get ancestral claims recognized.
Right.
It's a fight for survival, for the right to exist on their own terms.
The report mentions this thing called
Yeah.
free, prior, and informed consent.
Right. FPIC.
How does that fit into this whole land rights thing?
So FPIC is this fundamental principle in international law
Yeah.
when it comes to indigenous rights. It basically means that no decisions about development or resource extraction should be made on indigenous lands without their full consent
Okay.
and informed consent. That means no coercion, no manipulation, no shady deals happening behind the scenes.
That sounds simple enough,
Yeah.
but I have a feeling it doesn't always work out that way.
You're right. Unfortunately, FPIC is often ignored or completely bypassed.
So what happens when that happens?
Well, the consequences can be pretty devastating.
Yeah.
It can lead to displacement, environmental damage, loss of livelihoods, cultural disruption, even violence.
Wow.
The report gives tons of examples of projects
Yeah.
that went ahead without proper consent,
Yeah.
and the indigenous communities are left to deal with the consequences.
So are there any ways to prevent that from happening?
Well, I think one way is to raise awareness about FPIC.
Okay.
Make sure that indigenous communities themselves understand their rights
Yeah.
and that they have the tools and resources to advocate for those rights.
So it's about empowerment,
Exactly.
giving them a voice at the table.
Absolutely.
This leads us to another big challenge that's highlighted in the report, and
Yeah.
we touched on it a bit in that regional overview,
Right.
but it seems like it's a global issue,
Yeah, it is.
the impact of extractive industries.
Absolutely. The report really doesn't hold back.
Yeah.
It paints a pretty grim picture
Yeah.
of the effects of things like mining, oil and gas extraction, logging
Right.
on indigenous communities and their environments.
And it always seems to be the same story.
Yeah.
Environmental damage,
Right,
displacement, loss of livelihoods, and sometimes even human rights violations.
Yeah, it's a recurring theme, unfortunately.
Yeah, it really feels like this constant tug of war.
It's
It's
between economic development
Yeah.
and the protection of indigenous rights
Yeah.
and the environment. Is there any way to kind of reconcile those interests?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? How do
Yeah.
we balance those competing interests?
Right.
I think the report suggests that respecting FPIC
Okay.
is absolutely crucial.
Makes sense.
It's about making sure indigenous communities have a real say in what happens on their land
Yeah.
and that they actually benefit from any development that does happen.
Okay.
It's also about shifting away from these extractive models of development that prioritize profits
Right.
over long-term sustainability and well-being.
Yeah, that's a tough challenge.
It is,
Yeah.
but I think the report shows
Yeah.
that there are paths forward.
And of course, we can't forget about climate change,
Right.
which is kind of looming over all of this.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The report talks about how indigenous peoples, and especially those living in these vulnerable ecosystems, are disproportionately affected by climate change.
Right. They're on the front lines facing rising sea levels, changes in weather patterns, more frequent natural disasters,
Yeah.
and yet they've contributed the least to the
Right.
problem.
It's a double injustice.
It is. It's a real injustice.
Yeah, they're dealing with the consequences of something
Yeah.
that they didn't cause.
Yeah.
It's overwhelming. Like, there's no way to win.
I know it can feel that way.
Yeah.
But the report also points to the importance of traditional knowledge
Okay.
in climate change adaptation and mitigation.
Mm-hmm.
You know, indigenous peoples have this deep understanding of their environments,
Yeah.
and they've developed sustainable practices over generations.
So their knowledge could actually be part of the solution.
Exactly. The report argues that respecting and incorporating indigenous knowledge isn't just about cultural preservation.
Right.
It's about finding practical solutions to this global crisis.
So we can learn from them.
Absolutely. We can learn a lot
Okay.
from the way that they have lived in harmony with nature for centuries.
Okay, so we've got land rights, we've got extractive industries, we've got climate change. These are all huge, interconnected challenges.
Yes, they are.
What's the common thread that ties all these issues together?
I think the common thread, the fundamental issue underlying all of these challenges is self-determination.
Okay.
The right of indigenous peoples to freely determine their own political status, their economic development,
Yeah.
their cultural identity.
Yeah.
It's about control over their own destinies.
It's about agency.
Exactly.
Not having decisions made about their lives
Exactly.
without their input.
Yeah.
But as we've seen, it seems like exercising that right to self-determination is often met with resistance and obstacles.
It is. It's a constant struggle.
What can we as individuals even do to make a difference?
Well, I think the first step is awareness.
Okay.
Understanding the issues, learning about the challenges faced by different communities, and amplifying indigenous voices.
So education is key.
Absolutely.
We need to get informed ourselves.
Yeah.
And then spread the word to others.
Exactly.
So what are some ways we can do that?
Well, this report itself is a great resource.
Okay.
And there are so many other organizations and initiatives dedicated to raising awareness about these issues. You know, seek them out, learn from them, share what you learn with others.
Okay.
Social media can be a powerful tool for spreading information and connecting with indigenous-led movements.
Okay, so awareness and support are important.
Yeah.
But what about concrete action?
Well, we can advocate for policy changes.
Okay.
You know, contact your elected officials, let them know that these issues are important to you and hold them accountable for their actions.
So putting pressure on the people in power
Exactly.
to actually take action.
Yeah.
Are there other things we can do in our daily lives?
Yeah, I think we can all be more mindful consumers.
Okay.
Think about where your products come from,
Right.
the impact they have on indigenous communities. Support businesses that operate ethically and sustainably, and avoid the ones that are contributing to these problems.
So it's about recognizing that our choices have consequences.
Exactly.
Both positive and negative.
Absolutely.
Sometimes it's about getting out of our comfort zones and challenging the way things are.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. You know, we need to be willing to question our own assumptions and biases and to speak up when we see injustice happening.
And it's about approaching this issue with humility
Absolutely.
and a willingness to listen and learn.
Yes.
We don't have all the answers.
Yeah.
And indigenous peoples are the ones who are best equipped to lead this fight for their rights.
Exactly.
So we need to move away from these kind of paternalistic approaches
Absolutely.
and empower indigenous communities to make their own decisions about their futures.
I think that's a really key takeaway.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation.
It has.
I've learned a lot.
Yeah.
So what are some of the key things you hope listeners will take away from this deep dive?
Wow, it's amazing how much we've learned from just this one report.
I know, right?
Yeah.
And this report is over a decade old.
It really shows you how deep and how broad these IWGIA yearbooks are.
Yeah, absolutely. So much great information in here. One thing that keeps coming back to me as we've been talking about this is this constant tension between progress and pushback.
Yeah.
It's like this 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of dance.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does feel like this constant tug of war
Right.
between those who are pushing to uphold indigenous rights and then, you know, those who, for whatever reason, want to just keep things as they are.
On one hand, we see these positive developments like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, landmark legal cases,
Right.
this growing awareness of these issues.
Yeah, and there are more and more people who are paying attention to these issues and speaking out.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, we see these persistent violations of land rights,
Right.
the devastating impacts of these extractive industries,
Yeah.
this ongoing struggle for self-determination.
Yeah, it's a constant reminder that recognizing rights on paper is one thing, but actually putting those rights into practice is a whole other challenge.
So how do we break free from this cycle of progress and pushback?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think it really requires a fundamental shift
Yeah.
in the way we think about these issues.
Okay.
A move away from this dominant paradigm that sees Indigenous peoples as obstacles
Yeah.
to progress or resources to be exploited.
We need to start recognizing that Indigenous peoples aren't just stakeholders.
Yeah,
They are rights holders.
absolutely.
They have rights that need to be respected,
You do.
just like anyone else.
And it's important to understand that supporting Indigenous rights isn't about charity.
Right.
It's not about benevolence. It's about justice. It's about creating a world that is more equitable and more sustainable for all of us.
It's about recognizing that we are all connected
Exactly.
and that the well-being of Indigenous peoples is connected to the well-being of the planet.
Yeah, we're all in this together.
Absolutely. Something you mentioned earlier that keeps sticking with me is the sheer diversity
Right.
of these Indigenous experiences around the world. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to addressing these challenges.
Absolutely. We can't just come in with these prepackaged solutions and expect them to work everywhere.
We need to listen to Indigenous voices,
Yeah.
understand their needs, their
Right.
priorities,
And support their self-determined paths.
and ultimately recognize that their knowledge and their perspectives are essential for creating this better future
Absolutely.
for all of us.
I agree. This has been a really enlightening deep dive.
Yeah.
I'm so glad we had the chance to explore these issues together.
Yeah, me too. I've learned so much from this conversation. And before we wrap up,
Yeah.
I want to leave our listeners with a question.
Okay.
What can you do to support Indigenous people's rights in your community or on a global scale?
That's a great question to leave everyone with. Remember, every action, every voice raised contributes to this collective effort to create a more just and equitable world for everyone.
So thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.